you can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, play the news from The Australian.
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Monday, June 10. Chairman Peter Costello has resigned from the board of the Nine Entertainment Company. The former treasurer called it quits just days after a physical confrontation with a journalist from The Australian at Canberra Airport. His resignation is effective immediately and he'll be replaced by board member Catherine West. On Sunday afternoon, Mr Costello thanked the board for its support during a tumultuous few weeks for the media company. You can read that story right now at theaustralian.com.au. A body has been found on the Greek island of Symi, where a major search is underway for British TV doctor Michael Mosley. The remains were found by occupants of a private boat on the rocky coastline near an intricate cave system known as the Abyss. An umbrella was also discovered nearby. Local police believe the body belongs to Mosley, who disappeared during a walk on Wednesday afternoon. CCTV captured footage of Mosley carrying an umbrella before he vanished. Israeli troops pulled off a daring rescue mission over the weekend, reuniting 4 people snatched by Hamas on October 7 with their families in Israel. In today's episode, The Australian's foreign editor Greg Sheridan unpacks what this means for the Middle East and hopes of a permanent ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas.
לראות את יעקב ארגמני, אביה של נועה. אני מתקשה להדחיק את ההתרגשות.
On Saturday afternoon, local time, an anchor broke the news on Israeli TV. 4 civilians held captive for 8 long months had been freed. He broke down in tears as he read their names. On the beach in Tel Aviv, where it was 26 degrees and sunny, the reaction was one of pure joy. The rescue operation was risky and complex. Hostages were spread out across 2 apartment blocks in Gaza's Al-Nusrat region. It's the 3rd largest refugee camp in the Palestinian territories, and it's teeming with civilians displaced by the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Hamas militant group. Raiding the buildings separately would mean certain death for hostages held in whichever one Israeli forces struck second. If it was going to work, it had to happen swiftly and simultaneously. Shortly before midday on Saturday, the Israel military's chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, gave the order. It was time to go. Palestinians described their fear and confusion as bombs rained down, a strike designed to divert attention away from the rescue. After a brief gunfight in one of the buildings and a counterattack by Hamas fighters in the streets of Nusrat, one of the Israeli commanders sent word via radio. "We have the diamonds in our hands." The 4 hostages were whisked away to a nearby beach and loaded into helicopters that would take them, finally, home to Israel. The Israelis rescued in the broad daylight mission were all snatched from the Nova Music Festival on October 7, where hundreds more were massacred. They are Andrei Kozlov and Shlomi Ziv, who were both working as security guards at the festival, and Almog Miryan and Noah Argamani.
Noah Argamani has become a symbol of Israel's hostages being held in Gaza, filmed on the back of a motorbike being taken into Gaza by Hamas militants from the festival, used in Hamas propaganda videos while in captivity. Today, she is free, hugging her father, waiting to visit her terminally ill mother in a separate hospital.
The daring rescue comes at a crucial moment for Israel when public faith is flagging. Criticism is mounting around the globe too, as a humanitarian crisis unfolds in Gaza and Palestinian civilians become collateral damage in Israel's pursuit of Hamas.
It's an extraordinarily successful operation by the Israeli commandos.
Greg Sheridan is The Australian's foreign editor.
Israelis have found it very difficult to conduct this type of operation up till now because Hamas stores its hostages in the middle of civilians, and that puts a moral cost on any operation that Israel embarks on to rescue its hostages. It also is the case that by surrounding the hostages with Palestinian civilians, the minute there's an attack, the terrorists will kill the hostages. But, this operation shows us quite a few things. It shows us not only that the Israeli commandos are very competent, but it shows us that as a matter of policy, Hamas was keeping these innocent hostages in the middle of Palestinian civilians. So it was exposing the Palestinians to massive danger intentionally as a part of its geostrategic purposes. Then another thing we know from this operation is that there was a very severe firefight, rocket-propelled grenades launched by Hamas terrorists and so forth against the Israeli soldiers. So that also tells us that Hamas terrorists are embedded there in the midst of a refugee camp in the middle of civilians. This is the Hamas way of war, and this is what Hamas wants. They want Israel to be forced to go through the civilian population in order to get to them. I mean, the overwhelming moral responsibility for all of the suffering in Gaza lies with Hamas. So it is at least possible that the symbolic power of this moment will lead to a change both within Israel and internationally. I guess the hardest thing to predict is the effect that this has on the dark, savage, nihilistic reasoning of Hamas leadership itself. I mean, they could have had a ceasefire any time over the last 3 months in a minute. Time and again, the Americans have said, and the British have said, the Israelis have come up with an extremely generous ceasefire, and all we've got to do is get Hamas to agree. But the world, astoundingly, doesn't put Hamas under much pressure to do this, and Hamas's Arab interlocutors are very ineffective in putting them under any pressure. And I think it's a tribute to the nihilism and savagery of Hamas that it wants this situation to persist because it sees Israel continuing to be criticised and damaged internationally. The party standing in the way of a ceasefire, it's been this way for months, is Hamas, because Hamas likes this situation. It wants all this suffering because it's doing Israel damage in terms of its international reputation. But I think today you just focus on the wonderful news that 4 completely innocent people who were subject to terror and torture and just hideous cruelty by the world's most depraved terrorists are freed and rescued and back with their families.
For months now, negotiators from Qatar, Egypt and the United States have been working on a ceasefire deal that would see the remaining Israeli hostages freed and end the bloodshed in Gaza. And for months now, a deal has been elusive. On May 31, US President Joe Biden proposed a 3-phase solution on Israel's behalf. He said it would include the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, the exchange of Israel hostages for Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, and the repatriation of hostages killed during the conflict, an increase in humanitarian aid, and a permanent ceasefire.
I know there are those in Israel who will not agree with this plan and will call for the war to continue indefinitely. Some are even in the government coalition. And they've made it clear they want to occupy Gaza, they want to keep fighting for years, and the hostages are not a priority to them. Well, I've urged the leadership in Israel to stand behind this deal, despite whatever pressure comes.
But later, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly told lawmakers Biden's proposal is incomplete. Far-right members of his cabinet alleged the proposal was drawn up by the US without authorization, meaning Israel isn't legally required to commit to it. Hamas said its enemy's position is unclear. So where do the weekend's events leave a ceasefire deal?
The American Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the American National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the British Foreign Secretary David Cameron have said on a number of occasions, and quite clearly and repeatedly and explicitly, Israel has offered an extremely generous ceasefire. Now, Joe Biden's 3-part plan is a terrific plan, but it relies on a lot of things happening in the future, which you can't predict. So I think it's analytically, politically and morally quite wrong to equate Hamas and Israel as being equal roadblocks to a ceasefire. Now, I do think there is something dysfunctional about Netanyahu's position at the moment, and those two right-wing ministers are grubs, and it would be much better for Israel and all of its friends all around the world if they weren't in the government. But I don't think any Israeli Prime Minister would have handled this conflict up to now much differently from the way it's been handled now. And, you know, the Albanese government says Hamas must have no part whatsoever in Gaza's future and all the hostages must be released. But then it tells Israel to stop fighting at the same time. Well, how are you going to stop Hamas from having any role in Gaza's future or get the Israeli hostages released if Israel leaves Gaza permanently, as Hamas is demanding it do? So the question is, does Hamas have any interest in a ceasefire or not? And the idea that the Israelis will just stop and leave Hamas completely in charge so that it can rebuild itself and launch new waves of terror assaults on Israel in the future, I mean, that was never a go. That hasn't been offered by the Israelis at any point and wouldn't be offered by any Israeli Prime Minister. At the same time, I'm critical of Netanyahu for not coming up with his own clear plan of how Gaza should be run once the fighting stops. So it's extraordinarily murky, but let's be absolutely clear about this. The object to a ceasefire is not Israel. The object to a ceasefire is Hamas.
Coming up, the high human cost of Israel's risky rescue missions. Subscribers to The Australian get access to this kind of detailed analysis around the clock. A subscription also includes breaking news alerts, lively commentary, newsletters and access to special events. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au. We'll be back after this break. When Hamas launched its deadly attack on southern Israel on October 7, 250 people, including infants, children and elderly people, were taken into unknown horror over the border. They were hidden in areas densely populated by Palestinian civilians, schools, hospitals and apartment buildings, like the ones featured at the top of this episode. Before Saturday's daring mission, about 120 hostages remained in captivity across Gaza. Dozens have died. Only 7, including the group of 4 rescued on the weekend, have been freed through military operations. But Israel's leaders say their nation's retaliation against Hamas in Gaza will continue. In a post made to the social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter, on Saturday, Defence Minister Yoav Gallant said, "We will keep fighting until 120 hostages are home." Their loved ones have urged the international community to maintain pressure on Hamas to accept the proposed deal and guarantee their release.
That's not the way we can bring 120 hostages back home. We must, all of us together, the world, follow President Biden's speech and go with the deal.
The human cost of these kinds of operations is high. Representatives for Hamas said at least 210 people were killed in the crossfire of Saturday's rescue operation, and hundreds more were wounded. It's not known how many of those were Hamas soldiers. The Israeli Defence Force said the number was closer to 100 killed or injured.
An endless cycle of dead and wounded rushed into Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital Saturday, a medical centre already well over capacity and dangerously understaffed and undersupplied. It is a jarring view of 2 clashing impacts of one rescue mission.
So, for how much longer will the end justify the means?
Israel will have to make the calculation itself how much the military imperative of destroying Hamas weighs against the success of Hamas's international political campaign. Now, let me be clear, these deaths are a terrible tragedy. We mustn't be casual about them, and we have to honour them as human lives. But, as I say, the moral responsibility for this rests 100% with Hamas, because there is no nation on the earth, including Australia, which would not respond strongly if an October 7 attack were carried out on it and would not respond strongly in trying to get back its hostages. How long can they do it? Well, of course, until they get their hostages back. I mean, all the violence could stop tomorrow if Hamas released the hostages. I don't think that the Israelis will give up on their hostages. And it's a very, very difficult conflict to predict because, you see, Hamas doesn't really operate by rational or moral considerations at all. You're not dealing with a normal human actor. I mean, Hamas is absolutely indifferent to the suffering of the Palestinian people, and therefore it takes actions against Israel which more or less necessitate a strong Israeli military response. I certainly believe, as the late Australian soldier Jim Molan concluded when he conducted inquiries, that Israel behaves as morally as any Western army would in these circumstances. It tries hard to reduce civilian casualties. But that's not to deny that the political campaign against Israel has been tremendously effective. And it's been presented as a monster when it is a democratic state trying to protect its citizens against assault by the most depraved and savage and barbaric terrorists we've seen in modern times.
Greg Sheridan is the Australian's foreign editor. It was one of the most memorable prime ministerships in Australian political history. As part of the Australians' 60th anniversary celebrations, we're revisiting the momentous rise and fall of the Whitlam government. You can read the paper's original 1970s coverage right now at theaustralian.com.au.